Good evening and welcome to EmpowerU. I hope none of you are going to sleep tonight, don't you? I will though, because I'm drinking water. Thanks for coming tonight, and anybody online, thank you for logging in. I'm Betty Overstreet, the Executive Director. Do we have any new people here tonight? We do, okay, good. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about EmpowerU. EmpowerU was founded by Dan Reganol in 2011. He's also the founder and CEO of Frame USA. And his vision was to present classes on a diverse number of topics. At that time, I wasn't working with them, but I was one of their students. But they would go all over the city and have classes in libraries and schools, wherever they could get free space. And then Dan took part of his warehouse here and made this studio for us. So it makes it a lot easier and it's really nice. So Dan, we still thank you for that. Also, all of our classes that are in the studio are live streamed. So if you can't make it to a class, just log in at empoweruohio.org and go to the class and scroll to the bottom and sign in where it says virtual class. If you can't make it at all, but you want to see a class, it will be up on the website within a day or two afterwards, so you can go back and watch it. You can also tell your friends when you've been to a good class. Like we had one last week on dementia, so I've called some people and said, I think you ought to see that. As a matter of fact, I told both my daughters that. I said, you just never know. Said, you might need that for me. Anyway, we also welcome your feedback, good or bad. When we also like to have suggestions from you for anything that you think would be, that you would be interested in, we'll certainly look into it. It helps if you know a speaker for any suggestion you have, but if not, we'll do our best to find someone for your topic. We are a free university, but we powered only by donations, so we do pass around our little red buckets at the end of each class. Any amount that you feel you'd like to give is greatly appreciated. Also, our speaker would like to have questions at the end of his presentation tonight. So if you have a question at that time, just raise your hand and wait for one of us to bring the microphone to you so that everyone here in the studio, as well as those online, can hear the question. And I just want to talk about a couple classes before I have Dan come up. Next Thursday, so we have coffee tasting tonight. Next Thursday, we have bourbon tasting. So you know, you're really at each end of the spectrum there, and I don't drink either one, but I'm going to enjoy next week anyway. We're going to be going down to Shumrick and Lee's in Norwood. It's a fairly new distillery down there, and Terry Shumrick made wine for 30 years. He was also a chef. His family owned their own business, and now he's making bourbon. And he said going from wine to bourbon really wasn't that hard. So whether you're a bourbon drinker or not, you can come and socialize. You do need to sign up ahead of time. I think we're going to cut registration off by noon next Wednesday, I hope, because we're going to be serving food and I need to know what to get. So if you're interested, please go online and sign up. Then on April the 16th, we're going to have a class on the Doolittle Raid. A gentleman by the name of Ray Hughes is going to be presenting that class. I'm sure everybody in here has heard about the Doolittle Raid, but if you're like me, you don't remember all the little details about it, and he'll be telling us all about that. But the Doolittle Raid there was 80, there turned out to be veterans, but there were 80 that volunteered to go on this mission, not knowing where they were going or if they would come back, and all but 3 survived. So it's quite a story, even if you know about it. I'm sure you've forgotten a lot about it, so it'd be good to get an update on it. Be a good class for your grandkids, younger kids to come to as well. And then on April 19th, that's a Friday, there's going to be a class over at the Forest Park Senior Center. It's really the museum center that's presenting that class, and it's called Crosley Field Remembered. We're just partnering with them and advertising it for them, but it's from 12 to 1 o'clock. It would be good if you sign up, but it's not necessary. So at this time, I'd like to have Dan come up, and we have a door prize to give away. So you got a ticket when you came in, so just take out your tickets. I don't know what the door prize is by probably some coffee.
The door prize was purchased by our operations manager, Jill, in the back. Let's give her a round of applause. She helped a lot with this class. This is called the Coffee Dictionary. So let's get Dr. Rissover to draw a ticket for us. And that is number 801. Who's got number 801? All right, somebody, we rigged that because you're new, so. Your name is? Let's give Ashley a round of applause. There we go. Okay, so, I mean, geez, if Dave was nice enough to come and treat us to some coffee, I think we should give away a pound of his, actually 12 ounces of his coffee, LaTerza coffee. This is the regular stuff. If you want decaf, you can trade it in. So I was at this really super cool jazz club. I don't know if any of you like jazz. I didn't even know it existed, called Cafe Vivace down in Walnut Hills. If you like live jazz, go there. It is so neat. And I saw a big sign, Dave, of your coffee down there at the cafe. So I know you're doing something good. Let's draw one more name.
Where's my ticket?
And that ticket is number 803. 803. 803. Is that you, Amy? Okay, let's give it up for Amy, everybody. Congratulations. Trade it in if you want. And let's give Betty a round of applause. And also our treasurer, Bill Roll, and Jay in the back, who's our producer. Let's thank them, everybody. So just a couple of things before we get started. Was anybody here Tuesday night for the class on going to Mars? It was one of the most fascinating classes we've ever done. Watch the replay of it. It was just so interesting to see how much Elon Musk is taking our government to the cleaners in terms of their ability to do things like go places. And it was just a fascinating class. I really loved it. And it was great. A couple classes I wanted to tell you about. On a week from Monday, we will have the 10th anniversary of the Tea Party here. And that class is being sponsored by one of our guests tonight, Diane Landy. We appreciate that. And well, we're gonna have a lot of people here that night that have gone into all sorts of governmental activism areas that'll be talking to you. Mike Wilson will be here. Brian Thomas will be here. George Brenneman will be here from the western side of town. Justin Bennick Thomas, who was the guy when Sean Hannity came to Cincinnati that night to talk to 8,000 people, got to tell everybody that he wasn't gonna appear that night. He'll be here. And a bunch of kind of hopefully surprising guests will be here that night. Hope you can come. If you do, please bring some tea or coffee to donate to charity for that event. And then on April 23rd, a class that I'm super excited about. My friend Jack Grossman will be coming here from North Carolina to talk about his incredible book called A Child of the Forest, which is a story about a Holocaust survivor that survived for 2 years in the forest while she tried to escape. And Betty and I have both read it. It's an incredible book. I just couldn't hardly put it down. I had a friend of mine from high school. I went to high school with Jack. That's how I know him. And she read it and she wrote me about it last night. And she just said it's a great, great book. He's going to tell that story April 23rd. That's 2 weeks from tonight. I really recommend you come to that class. It's going to be great. So let me tell you about our guests. We're really glad Dave Gaines could come tonight from LaTerza to join us. He's brought, how many, 6 different kinds of coffee, Dave? Anything you want to tell us about your company? Or is that going to come later in? Okay, that'll come later in the event. But let's thank him right up front for getting us some coffee. And are we free to just kind of come back as we want to fill up, and we'll get amped up, and we'll take this, yeah, we'll rock this place. So Dr. Jay Rissover is our speaker tonight, and he's been in internal medicine since 1989. He's a senior physician at Blue Ash Internal Medicine on Glendale Milford Road, which is just overlooking that incredible Summit Park. Can you walk up that? Are you able to walk up that? You haven't done it. Let's do that. You've taken the elevator. That's good. He's the director of inpatient medicine at Tri-Health Hospital in Evendale, and is a teaching attendant for the Bethesda Family Practice Residency at Bethesda North Hospital. He's a second-generation physician, married with 2 adult children and 1 dog. Dr. Rissover is active in the Jewish community, and his favorite charity is the Cincinnati Chicken Soup Cook-Off, which happens the last week in January. He likes science fiction, archery, fencing, juggling, good food, movies, music, and keeping physically fit. He enjoys speaking and has spoken at EmpowerU, and one of our favorite classes was 10 things you can do to live longer. So hopefully coffee drinking is part of that. I had one question for you, Dr. Rissover, before we start. So Betty and I are always trying to analyze the people that come to our EmpowerU classes. And we have slightly more people that have signed up for the bourbon drinking session we're doing next week as opposed to coffee. Now, does that say anything in particular about the people?
I think that says a lot about human nature.
Okay. So we appreciate you coming to talk to us tonight. Thank you. We're glad to have you.
That's just the way to start. Did we lose it? How about that? So, and actually, Dan Reginault, the founder of EmpowerU, the man who made all this possible, who does monthly charity work here at his company and does an annual charity. I got to thank Dan for starting EmpowerU and making all this possible. Dan Reginault, thank you. Okay, and I'm back up. Good. So, the reason I encourage you all to go up and have some more coffee while I'm talking is A, I tend to put people to sleep and that will prevent that. And B, it just tastes so good, so you should have some. And C, when you finish this, you're going to want to have several cups of coffee. So coffee, friend or foe? That is the question before us. And we've heard a lot of bad things about coffee. And let's see, how about that? It worked perfectly. This is the way I think about, wait, I got to have some more. Isn't that the way you are in the morning? Shh, almost. Now you may speak. The first cup of coffee is gone. So coffee is a really wonderful ancient herb, berry, food, medicine. It's been around for a long time, and I thought it might be fun to start with the history of coffee and then move on to some medical facts that may or may not astound you about coffee. Coffee is very old, but it is not known exactly how it was discovered, but there are 2 stories often told. I bet there are some in the audience who know these stories. The first one, Kaldi of Kaffa. Kaffa was in Ethiopia, and you kind of see where the name of coffee is coming from. Kaldi was a shepherd boy, and he was tending his goats back in around 850 AD, or so the story goes. This story actually wasn't written down until the 1500s, so this is the story as related. So, sorry. I tried to, hit that button. So there, of course, is Kaldi with his goats. And he noticed one day as he was tending his goats that all the goats were prancing about and they were jumping around. They're very energetic. Now, baby goats are like that, kids, but the old goats were doing it too. He thought, this is amazing. Being a smart boy, he looked around and saw they were eating these red berries from a singular plant that was there growing red berries. Well, he didn't know much about this plant, so he picked up some of the berries, smelled them, chewed some himself. Didn't taste very good, but he started to feel energetic. He was energized. He felt invigorated. He thought, wow, this is great. So he stuffed his pockets full of berries, and he went home to tell his mom, Mom, look what I found, magic berries. No beanstalk, but anyway. So his mom suggested that he should take the berries to the local monastery. Now, this is an Islamic area, so you may be thinking of a monastery that's totally different from the monastery he took it to. But he took it to the monks, and they looked at his berries and listened to his story, and they threw them on the fire, and they said, this is the work of the devil. What are you doing bringing this to us? This is terrible. And it sat in the fire, and it started to burn, and this aroma came out of the fire, and the monks smelled it. It smelled really good, like roasting coffee. And so they rescued the berries, which had turned black, and they kind of stomped on them. They get the embers out, and then they put them in some water to put them out. And then they noticed the water was kind of changing color, and it kind of smelled good. And so one of them decided to drink some of the water. And then he experienced the invigorating effects that Caldi had noticed and the goats had noticed. He got the other monks to have some, and then they decided that indeed this wasn't the work of the devil. This was a good and noble thing, that this they could use to continue to say their prayers even longer without falling asleep. So they deemed it a very good thing. They started collecting the berries, they figured out ways to roast them, they boiled them, and they drank this, and it kind of spread and spread and spread. This is the story of Caldi and the discovery of coffee. But that's in Ethiopia. In Yemen, in Mocha, they have a totally different story. Totally different story. So Sheikh Omar was a doctor priest in about 575 AD. So this predates Caldi. Caldi is the more popular story. That's the one you'll generally hear. If you look it up on Wikipedia, that's what you're going to find. But Sheikh Omar was a doctor priest, very respected man. He worked for his master who was lying on his deathbed. And instead of tending to his master, he treated the master's daughter. And the master passed away, the daughter got better, and he decided to take his payment from the daughter in, shall we say, services rendered. In other stories, they say he just did something bad. Well, anyway, you can guess perhaps what it was he did, but the king banished him for this act. It was pretty bad. Banished him, and he went off into a mountain, and he was in a cave in a mountain, and he was there, and he didn't have much to eat. And one story, a bird brought him a bush with berries. Another, he's just hungry, and he found the berries. So he took the berries. He has no food. He tries to eat them. They're really, they're red, and they don't taste too good, and they're hard. So he puts them in the fire to try and, soften them up. Well, they turn black, and they're even harder. So he can't chew them or do anything with them. So he puts them in some water and puts the water on the fire and kind of boils them to try and soften them up. Well, the water starts changing color, turns black. He noticed this wonderful aroma coming from the water and decides instead of chewing on these hard, terrible beans, he's going to drink the water and thus experience the invigorating effect that hopefully some of you are feeling right now. So he took this discovery with him, he took it back to Mocha, and he became proclaimed as a great man. In fact, there is a shrine to Sheikh Omar, the inventor of coffee, in Mocha to this day. So two competing stories of the history of coffee. Truth may be in between or something like it. But in Mocha, you had these Sufi mystics who would travel in great caravans spreading the coffee far and wide throughout Arabia, through Egypt, Turkey, everywhere. So the years passed, coffee spread. It was a strong drink in this area. And as years went by, say 1500s, the Ottoman Empire came and they decided to grab up the coffee trade. I mean, they needed money to fund their empire. And so they took all these countries that were growing, Ethiopia, Yemen, they were growing coffee, and they controlled the trade. Well, this upset some of the farmers who were growing coffee. So they smuggled live coffee beans and bushes out, and they found a place that was outside the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, that had a similar climate. So they went to Indonesia, started growing coffee there. And another great coffee place became Java in Indonesia, which is also known for its coffee. So coffee spread from the Arabic world. It made it to Europe, of course. And in London, there were a tremendous number of coffee houses. This is about the 1500s in London, what a coffee house might look like. And there were 88 of them in the 1500s. And the next year, there were 160. It grew dramatically. And of course, it went from England to America, the colonies. And coffee was a drink in the Americas too. Now, some of us may recall there was this little incident in the colonies where the local colonists decided they were upset about King George's tax on tea. You had to purchase an extra tax to get your tea. It became very expensive, and everybody drank tea. Everybody in Great Britain, everybody in America drank tea, and this was an affront. So some patriots dressed up as Indians grabbed a bunch of tea off a ship in the Boston Harbor, threw it into the water, and thus started some of the acts that led to the American Revolution. Something about the taxing of tea became associated with Britain and in the imperialism there, and overlords and dictators and tyranny. And so coffee became the drink of America. Coffee was the drink of Americans. That was the drink of patriots, of Paul Revere, and everyone else. So coffee became such an American beverage that, well, we drink it to this day. So how would you like your coffee? Small, large, or like me, intravenous? Wait a minute, time for another sip. So let's talk a little bit about caffeine. Probably the thing that you think of first when you think of coffee besides the flavor is, oh my God, it's 7:30 at night. Can I really have a cup of caffeine? Well, you probably shouldn't if your sleep will be impaired, if you don't sleep well. Caffeine is a bit of a stimulant. If you drink it a lot, you'll become used to it. Caffeine has a lot of interesting qualities. Coffee has a lot of interesting qualities. It's true that coffee contains caffeine. You can see here some of the amounts of caffeine on the board. A cup of coffee, this says between 95 and 165 milligrams of caffeine in it. I always think that in my mind, 50 to 150. That's my kind of measurement in my head. You know, it depends how strong it is, how you brew it. So when you buy a cup of coffee, it's going to have about that much caffeine in it. Notice at the bottom, they have instant, only 63 milligrams of caffeine in it. So it's like a weekly brewed. But of course, you can always put more than 1 teaspoon in and increase your caffeine content. We have on the other side tea, 25 to 48 milligrams of caffeine. Brewed black, obviously 25 to 48. And green, slightly less, 25 to 29. Of course, decaf is 2 to 5, just like decaf brewed coffee, 2 to 5 milligrams of caffeine. But what does caffeine do to you? What does coffee do to you? Well, it has some known side effects. It can cause a little tremor, perhaps, if you drink a lot of it. Caffeine can. It can make you urinate. There's definitely an effect to make your bladder work and make you produce urine. You might go to the bathroom. It might actually make you defecate. Some people, it can do that. It may be arrhythmogenic, but I'm going to present some studies to dispel that. But I do think in caffeine-naive people, it can be arrhythmogenic. That means it can produce extra heartbeats, palpitations, perhaps a rapid pulse. But it doesn't do it as uniformly as we think. And in fact, I think that effect goes away with chronic use. And I will show you some data to that effect. But first, caffeine. This is just regular caffeine. What about soda pop? That's also a source of caffeine. You can see in cola, 24 to 46. Can't press my button very quickly. Energy drinks have 164 milligrams. I see I shouldn't turn my head. Every time I turn my head, I have static. My apologies. 27 to 164 milligrams of caffeine in an energy drink, depending on the brand. I'm not making the beeping noise. So, energy shots have 40 to 100 milligrams, so it depends, that little shot. It's just amounts of caffeine. I have a couple of Starbucks here because I don't really care for Starbucks. It's kind of burnt. It's kind of mass produced. I think LaTerza is much better, but you know, that's just me. But it gives you an idea of this is a pretty common type of coffee and the milligrams of caffeine and various other drinks. Note there, the blonde roast, the second one, in a short, and that's 8 ounces, is 180 milligrams of caffeine, a little bit more than a typical Pike's Place brewed coffee. Yeah, so it's interesting. You would think that the lighter roast might have less caffeine. Not necessarily true. And I heard a very interesting explanation for that, having to do with the density of the beans. But I'm going to leave that to our expert in coffee, perhaps. And then here's some espressos and macchiatos, the amount of caffeine in them. So we've talked about what are some of the negative effects of caffeine, but what everybody thinks about is, does caffeine cause high blood pressure? That's a good question. Does it? Well, surprisingly enough, there's some studies on this. I guess that's why I'm here. So they did a study with medical students, of course. That's what medical researchers research on most commonly. And they took students and just gave them caffeine. They gave them 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine. Remember, that's like 3 cups of coffee, 2 cups of coffee, depending how strong your coffee is, right? So they gave them 200 to 300 and then 300 milligrams of caffeine. They had 2 groups of students. Some were caffeine and coffee naive, and the other group were regular coffee drinkers, regularly exposed to caffeine. And they measured their blood pressure. So what happened? In the group that was naive, they gave them a dose of 200, 300 milligrams of caffeine. Their blood pressure went up. 5 millimeters of mercury, systolic and diastolic. So yeah, it went up. That's not a dramatic thing. I'm an internist. I treat this all the time. The difference between stage 1 and stage 2 hypertension, 140 over 90, 150 over 100. So those are 10 millimeter differences. But still, it's an increase, and every increase is bad, and I can tell you that. So that 5 millimeter increase is not good. So what about the other group that drinks coffee all the time? Check them. Their blood pressure didn't change. No increase. They kind of get used to the effect. So they took the group here that was naive and gave them caffeine for a couple of weeks. It took 1 week for that to go away. Blood pressure did not go up with daily caffeine, 200, 300 milligrams. So while indeed it may raise blood pressure, if you drink coffee regularly, it seems to not affect your blood pressure. But that's caffeine. What about coffee? Caffeine and coffee are different. Caffeine is just one of the components in coffee, that wonderful mysterious brew with all kinds of organics and volatile compounds and a nice smell. So hypertension, there are 8 articles looking at 10 different studies that investigated the risk of high blood pressure with the level of coffee consumption. They looked at 243,000 individuals. Now, in scientific studies, if you see a study of like 10 people, it means nothing. If you see a study of 100 people, yeah, maybe that means something. 100 is like the lowest number, depending on what you're measuring and the standard deviation. It might mean something. You get 1,000, you're beginning to get a number that means something. 1,000, 2,000, okay, I can probably believe this. 243,000 people, that's kind of believable. That's a lot of people. Now, admittedly, from different studies put together, so that has some problems with the science of it. But they had 243 people in this study, 58,000 cases of hypertension, and they found in these studies the risk of hypertension was reduced, as you can see up there, by 2% with each 1 cup of coffee increment of coffee consumption. You drink 1 cup, your risk of hypertension goes down by 2%. 2 cups a day, 4%. 3 cups, 6%. So, chronic coffee consumption. That was a pretty good study. There's more. Now, we talked about arrhythmias, perhaps. So there was a Kaiser Permanente study presented at the American Heart Association in 2010, and they looked for people hospitalized with heart rhythm disturbances and looked data on 130,000 health plan members. You know, Kaiser Permanente has all kinds of health data on their people. So looked at 130,000 of their people and found those who reported drinking between 1 and 3 cups of coffee had a lower risk than the non-drinkers of being hospitalized for heart rhythm problems. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have a palpitation or a rapid heart from drinking their coffee, but they're less likely to go to the hospital because of it. Don't know exactly what that means, but it's nice data. And so they also said in a 2012 study that by drinking coffee in moderation, whatever that means, 2 to 3 cups a day, 5 to 7, no, 2 to 3 cups a day, it may also protect slightly against heart failure. But that's pretty wishy-washy, isn't it? How about this one? There was an EPIC study in 2017. That was just a couple of years ago. This EPIC is the European Perspective Investigation into Cancer Nutrition. So there was 10 different countries in Europe, you know, Swedes and Brits and Franks and Italians and all these people. 521,000 people, again, a good number, were included. So coffee drinkers compared with non-coffee drinkers, they found the highest quartile of coffee consumption had a lower all-cause mortality. From all causes of death, you were less likely to die if you're in that highest quartile of drinking. And then there was inverse associations observed for specific disease states. Digestive disease mortality for men. So that's a combination of colon cancer, liver cancer, gastric cancer, pancreatic cancer, all those cancers. They found it was a statistically significant association with circulatory disease, that's heart attacks, and then also with cerebrovascular disease, that's strokes. So death from all of these reasons significantly reduced if you're in the highest quartile of coffee drinkers. And it didn't vary by country. It didn't vary, you know, Swedes weren't any different from Brits, etc. So there was a study done in California the same year, and they looked at 185,000 people. I know it's a little smaller than the EPIC study, but it was only one state. It wasn't the whole country. So, and they looked at a bunch of ethnicities. They looked at African Americans, Native Hawaiians, Japanese Americans, Latinos, and whites who were aged 45 to 75. And they looked at total and cause-specific mortality between those years, 1993 and 2012. So compared with drinking no coffee, the coffee consumption was associated with a lower total mortality, and they did adjust for smoking and other causes. Because, you know, it used to be a habit back in the day that, you know, whenever you had your cup of coffee, you might be drinking a cigarette. I mean, 30 years ago, that was the habit, right? And 20 years ago. I bet very few of us who drink coffee here smoke cigarettes anymore. Some do. It's a declining thing. So the 1 cup per day hazard ratio was 0.88, 2 cups per day, 0.82. And I'm going to explain hazard ratios in a moment. Aren't you excited? Greater than 4 cups a day, 0.82 also. So the trend was very good. The trends were similar, and there were inverse associations noted for deaths, due to heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease, stroke, diabetes, and kidney disease. But this is all a mishmash of stuff, right? It's kind of all added together. Let's look at some of this data. I know it's illegible, and I apologize. Every time I expanded it so you could see it, it blurred out and you couldn't see anything. But I do want you to just look at the graphs. So I'm going to turn my back to you for a moment. So there are 3 slides here. The top one is cardiovascular disease. The bottom one is coronary heart disease. And this one is supposed to be, and I can't even read it, stroke. That's why, there's no abbreviation. So heart disease in the middle, stroke combined. So they're showing the same data 3 different ways. Well, these 2 added up to this one. This line here is the relative risk. That's 1. You're going to hear relative risk once in a while. If you have statisticians, engineers, mathematicians in the audience, you know what I'm going to say. You can tune out for a minute. But let me explain this simply. If you want to figure out if something is causing something, you do a relative risk. If it has 0 effect on it, it's a relative risk of 1. There is no cause, no change. If it tends to promote it, to increase it, it's above 1. If it tends to reduce it, it's below 1. Pretty simple. And it's a statistical test. So we're seeing here that for stroke, this is the data points here actually found, that it's under 1, goes to 0.9, almost to, well, 0.95 or something. And same here for heart disease. Not quite as far away, but it's 0.9 again. Good, okay. And then this one, which is combined, again, the similar thing. You see in this one and this one, they tend to come back up again when you get to 10 cups a day. So the benefit seems to be at 5 cups. See that? 5 cups, maybe 4. 4 or 5 is where it kind of flattens out and you stop getting benefit from drinking more cups of coffee a day. So your chance of dying from stroke, heart attack, or combined heart disease goes down until you get 5 cups of coffee a day, and then it may flatten out, may even go up a little in this one study. This is so true. Doctors can't fix stupid, but we can sedate it. Although not with this. We need something, that would be the bourbon next week. So let's hone in a little bit. Let's talk about stroke in women. Why women? Because they have a lot of strokes. So there was a study done in 2009, which followed the dietary habits of over 80,000 women for more than 20 years. They found the long-term consumption of coffee wasn't linked to a higher risk of stroke. Prior to that, we thought it did. We thought coffee caused strokes. We thought it led to high blood pressure. We thought coffee was bad for you. I remember in medical school, I read a Harvard heart study that followed graduates of Harvard who filled in a questionnaire on their coffee consumption. And it said the risk of heart attack would be doubled at 5 cups a day and be a little increased at 2 cups a day. And so I took that as I should never drink 5 cups of coffee a day, but I could probably have 2. So, but that wasn't a well-done study. It was just all based on questionnaires. These studies are much better. So anyway, in this one, they looked at 80,000 people. That study was probably 2,000 people. Now, in this, they showed that drinking 3 cups a day reduced the risk by nearly 20% compared to less than 1 a month, essentially not drinking. A 20% reduction by drinking 3 cups a day. So, and they just found a straight line association. The risk of stroke went down as coffee consumption went up. So in 2011, there was a Swedish study done that followed 30,000 women for 10 years. They found those who drank more than 1 cup a day appeared to have a 22 to 25% lower risk of stroke. That was compared to non-drinkers, of course. They found lower or no coffee consumption was associated with an increased risk of stroke, unlike some of the other studies. So these findings were the same regardless of smoking, alcohol, body mass index, all these contributing confounding factors. For women, coffee drinking may mean a lower risk of stroke. I mean, this is 2 different studies with a lot of women, and it goes with the other studies I showed you. I think more coffee, less stroke. But let's go to another disease, type 2 diabetes. I don't know if any of you listened to me. There was a time 7 years ago or so I was on the radio. I Take Charge of Your Health on Sunday nights on 55 KRC. I co-hosted with Randy Wolf. And I actually talked about this then. In fact, I was on Brian Thomas's show once talking about this very thing. But that was a long time ago. I didn't have this much research. I basically just talked about a couple of studies I'd found that found an inverse relationship between coffee and diabetes. The more coffee, the less risk of diabetes. Well, here's this Frank Hu is a researcher at Harvard. He looked into this link. And he found that participants who reported drinking more than 6 or 7 cups of coffee a day were 35% less likely to have diabetes compared to those who were drinking under 2 cups a day. And for those drinking 4 to 6, the risk was reduced to 28%. So he thinks the theory, it's not so much the caffeine, he thinks there's a whole package of nutrients inside coffee that causes this. He's not linking to the caffeine, it's all the nutrients and the phenols and the antioxidants in coffee. But that's just one guy. 2009, there was an international study led by Australia, which they reviewed 18 different studies covering nearly 458,000 people. That's 500,000. And they found that for every extra daily cup of coffee consumed, there was a 7% reduction in the risk for developing type 2 diabetes. So if you drink 3 cups a day, you have a 21% less risk of developing diabetes. It was amazing study, amazingly statistically significant. There were similar reductions for tea and decaf coffee, thus further reducing the link with caffeine. It might be the other phenols and the other things that are found in the coffee. And Lord knows what tea and coffee have in common. I mean, there's theobromine in tea and coffee. It's amazing. But be that as it may, they both seem to have a similar effect. Now, they did say, however, in the small print, that some of the studies they'd looked at were smaller, less reliable. So they say maybe the link isn't as strong as we found. So another meta-analysis was done in 2018 by another group of researchers. This time they looked at 1,185,000 people. I can't believe that, 1 million people they were looking at. There were 53,000 cases of diabetes in this 1 million people. They found those in the highest category of coffee consumption with an average of 5 cups a day had a 29% lower risk of type 2 diabetes compared with those who drank no coffee at all. So they looked at that risk and they figured that was a 6% reduction for each cup of coffee increase. So in this study, if you drink 3 cups, it's only 18% instead of 21% decline. So the numbers are off a bit. They have different numbers, different studies, different people, but the graph seems the same in all these studies. I think it's pretty strong. More coffee, less diabetes. Now I gotta say, this is observational studies. I'm waiting for the study. We take a bunch of diabetics, you give these guys coffee, you give these no coffee and see what happens. Or you take people who have pre-diabetes and give them a bunch of coffee, another group not, and see what happens. Because if it works to prevent, treat, reduce diabetes, that study needs to be done. It's not. Maybe they're doing it now somewhere, I hope. But just to throw cold water on this wonderful facts, I mean, it could be that as you drink more coffee, diabetics get worse, they lose the taste for coffee. So they drink less coffee. They used to drink it, they stop. So that would also explain these facts. I've talked to diabetics, I've never seen that. I don't think that's true, but that's just possible. Anyway, I'm excited by this. So this is just a graph from that study, kind of shows the same thing. Again, this is our relative risk. Remember 1? If it's under 1, it's real, it's reducing it, and boy, this one's more of a straight line to 11 cups. I didn't explain the dotted lines, maybe just briefly. So that's like 2 standard deviations away from the data points. And what that means is, in mathematical jargon, which I don't understand, but I'm a real person, the chance of this being real follows in this cone. This is reality, this is likely. And it's more likely closer to here, but it's still pretty likely out in here, less and less likely the further you get away. But if you go past the dotted lines, it's extremely unlikely that this has anything to do with anything. So you can pretty much believe that the truth is somewhere in this cone and most likely to be around along this line. So your relative risk of having coffee goes to 0.6 if you have 8 cups of coffee a day. Diabetes and coffee, is it the caffeine? Well, I think if decaf and tea, which has less caffeine, do work, then maybe not. So what would it be? Well, there's antioxidants like chlorogenic acid and trigonylene, and these have been found to reduce early glucose and insulin levels, so it might be that. It might be the coffee polyphenols, which do seem to have an anti-diabetic effect. And though caffeine has an effect, and it's related to insulin sensitivity, so maybe it is caffeine. There's an association between habitual coffee drinking and amyloid A lipoprotein levels. So, so that is a possibility. There's adiponectin and interleukin-6. Adiponectin affects weight and insulin sensitizing effects. And then, of course, it could be sex hormone binding globulin, which also apparently is affected by coffee consumption. So just some of the things that coffee may have an effect on that may cause this effect we've been seeing. So yeah, I hate being in purgatory. What Wait, purgatory. The anguished prolonged period spent waiting for a fresh pot of coffee to be ready. Yes, I've been there. Let's talk about another disease. I almost forgot about this one, Alzheimer's. So in 2009, some researchers in Finland and Sweden looked at a study that followed 1,400 people. Yeah, I know, only 1,400, not a million, not a 500,000, I don't know. You know, maybe we can't believe this. Only 1,400. Over 20 years though, that's pretty tough to do. And they found those who drank 3 to 5 cups of coffee a day in their midlife years, their 50s, 60s, they had a 65% lower chance of developing dementia in Alzheimer's compared to those who drank no coffee at all. So I've definitely got to remember to drink my coffee. In 2012, in South Florida, they published a paper describing how they monitored memory and thinking processes of 124 people. So this is a much smaller study. They aged 65 to 88 and found those with higher blood levels of caffeine, and this is mostly from coffee, but some from other things. They seem to avoid the onset of Alzheimer's. Those who have the highest levels, the onset of Alzheimer's was pushed back on them compared to those people who didn't have the high levels of caffeine. Caffeine may help. It does seem to stimulate mental processes. What about Parkinson's disease? Who would have thunk? So there was a study on the risk of developing Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And in this study in 2010, in North Dakota, they thought that it may help preserve the blood-brain barrier. Now, you may not be aware of this, but the brain actually has a barrier around it, keeping things from the blood getting into the brain. It makes it difficult actually to treat meningitis and some other brain conditions because you have to engineer a medication that will actually go through this barrier that's there. But they found that coffee may have something to do with that barrier. So there was, in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease in 2010 from Lisbon, they presented an analysis of 26 different studies. And they found an association between coffee and the chance of developing Parkinson's. For every increase of 300 milligrams per day in caffeine intake, excuse me, and that's what, 1 to 3 cups of coffee a day, maybe 2 cups of coffee, depending if you're 150 milligram heavy coffee. They found a 24% drop in the relative risk of developing Parkinson's. And among those who regularly drank 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day, there was a 25% lower risk of developing the disease compared to non-coffee drinkers. So that may help there. So I just bought a medical alert bracelet that says I probably need coffee. Not insulin, coffee. What about liver cancer? Who knew this? In 2007, there's a study done in Milan, and they did a pooled analysis of 10 different studies of 2,200 people, and they found that hepatocellular carcinoma, which they call HCC, that among coffee drinkers, there was a 41% reduction in risk of hepatocellular carcinoma compared to those who never drank coffee. And that's the common form of cancer. So in 2000, there was another large population-based study involving 60,000 Finns at the University of Helsinki, and they followed for a median of 19 years. And they also found that higher coffee consumption was linked to a lower risk of developing liver cancer. So with these studies, they've calculated the risk of by drinking a cup of coffee a day may reduce your risk of liver cancer by 15%. So maybe you drink so much coffee, you can't drink the alcohol that causes liver cancer, so I don't know. But, oh yeah, that's for the bourbon talk next week. I keep forgetting. What about basal cell skin cancer? And again, 110,000 people, they just found that the more caffeine there was in their diets, the less likely they were of developing basal cell carcinoma. Basal cell is a skin cancer that's really not too deadly. It hardly ever kills anyone. That's one of the cancers that if your doctor finds it, I mean, you could wait 5 years and then remove it. It grew a little bit, it won't spread. I mean, you should get rid of them, but you don't want to keep them as a pet, but not like melanoma, which can kill you in 6 months. But still, it causes a cancer, it may help prevent it. That's good. What about prostate cancer? The men are perking up all of a sudden. So there was a study done by in a Molisani cohort in the International Journal of Cancer in 2017. 6,900 men, I'm going to call it 7,000, in this cohort who were greater than 50 years old, followed for 4 years or so, and they found 100 new prostate cancer cases. So then they did an analysis and showed that the subjects at the highest consumption of coffee, greater than 3 cups of coffee, had a 53% lower prostate cancer risk as compared to participants the lowest consumption, which was 0 to 2 cups, which is interesting. Greater than 3 and heck of a way to prostate cancer cell. Human prostate cell. Another one? Sure.
Sorry about that, Doc.
This is, yeah. Trade you. Oh, that's not a problem. I can hold this, I think. That does sound better, less static. Thank you all. Sorry about that. So both human prostate cancer cell lines were treated with caffeine, showed a reduction in their proliferative and metastatic behaviors. Now, this is not an in vivo study. That wasn't in people. That was an in vitro study in cell lines. The other one, we followed the men. That was just following the men in the prostate. So we have two different studies here showing that it can reduce prostate cancer. So in conclusion, from the first study, the reduction by Italian-style coffee, think espresso, because this was done in Italy, this Italian-style coffee consumption of prostate cancer risk greater than 3 cups a day was observed in an epidemiological level. So, and then there was a study done where they had men who drink 4 or more cups of coffee a day, and they had a 59% less risk of prostate cancer recurrence or progression compared to those whose coffee consumption was 1 cup a week. Now, those are men who already had prostate cancer, and they were determining to see if it came back again after treatment or if it progressed. So that sounds pretty good. If you have prostate cancer, you probably should drink coffee. There was a 2014 meta-analysis of 12 different studies involving 7,900 prostate cancer cases. There were 9,000 controls, and they had to comb through 455,000 subjects to find these. The results found that the highest level, 4 to 5 cups of coffee a day consumption, was associated with reduced risk of overall prostate cancer. Sadly, it also showed an inverse association with fatal and high-grade prostate cancer. Now I want to explain that to you for a minute. That sounds terrible, but it probably isn't. Avodart and Proscar also show this, that they reduce prostate cancer, but there is a sort of increase in high-grade cancers, high-grade prostate cancers in those people treated. So what happens, what probably happens, nobody knows for sure. So it definitely reduces cancer. This study has shown that. And in Avodart and Proscar, you can reduce cancer too. But as it turns out, it probably reduces the low-level cancers, the ones that aren't too aggressive. Coffee may not affect the high-level ones, as you can see from this study, and we know Avodart and Proscar don't either. So if you take 100 men who have prostate cancer and say 70 of them have low-grade cancer and 30 of them have high-grade cancer, and you give them coffee, per the study, you reduce the low-grade cancers. Let's say you can cut it by 1/3. So it goes from 70 to, say, 40. My math is off, but it doesn't affect the high-grade cancers. You still got 30 of them. So now you got 40 and 30, you got 70 cases of cancer, but almost half of them are high-grade, and before only 1/4 of them, 1/3 of them were high-grade. So it looks like there's a relative increase in high-grade, but really it just didn't affect it. It affected the low-grade cancer. So sadly, it looks like coffee may help low-grade cancer, maybe not all prostate cancer. But you know, I only really need a coffee on days ending with the letter Y. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to me and being such an attentive audience. I think we have figured out that coffee is a friend and not a foe. I'll take a few questions now, and then I'm going to turn this over to David Gaines, the man who made this really wonderful coffee. Excuse me. Any questions? Well, here, I'll just walk over to you. They're going to walk a microphone. Well, all right. I don't want to step on Dan's toes.
Here's the question right here.
Kathy, how'd you get so interested in coffee?
I saw this study about 7 years ago about the diabetes correlation. I thought that was amazing. I'm in primary care. I'm an internist in Blue Ash, and I treat a lot of people with diabetes. And it'd be nice to tell them something good for a change about diabetes. You got diabetes, but you know, you drink some coffee, it might help. So, and frankly, I love speaking at EmpowerU, and I take these lectures as an opportunity to learn something. So I'd actually been doing research for a couple of months, finding all this research on coffee and educating myself on it. I didn't know all this stuff till I decided I wanted to learn about it, and so I gave this lecture. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating, the information that's out there.
Other questions for Dr. Rissover right here.
Thank you, Mr. Powell.
David, and I had read that your creamer is not your friend with coffee.
Oh, that is almost certainly true. So he said, I'm sure you heard it, that the creamer is not your friend. And that is true. Creamer, of course, is usually fat. And many times saturated fat. And I guess we all kind of know saturated fat may or may not be so good. Actually, commonly polyunsaturated fats, we know those are the worst. So yeah, you know, there are some questions of how bad fats are and which fats are bad. And that's a whole other lecture, which I could certainly give. But it's better to drink something without fat in general than with fat. So yeah, creamer is not your friend. Well, now, and David, I think you're correct there too. So coffee, milk can be a chelating agent. And it can bind, it's got calcium in it, it's got other things in it, it can bind to 1,000,001 organic molecules. And as we said, there's like 5 or 7 different organic compounds in coffee that might have some beneficial effects. Who knows how many of them get attached to the milk and then are unable to be absorbed. So that is another effect. But you know me as a doctor, I had to think of the fats first.
Other questions?
Well, I must have explained it well. Everybody knows everything.
Right.
There'll be a small quiz though. So,
Dr. J, how did the coffee get to South America, Latin America?
I imagine by ships. I mean, you know, once it was popular, you know, if it was only grown in a few areas and people were going to other countries, they could see that, you know, the climate might work. I mean, I don't know the story of coffee in every continent, but I know how this worked. I know, you know, the way men's minds work. You know, if they went to South America and they said, wow, this is kind of like coffee. Well, I take that back. Coffee, I think, was indigenous. No, it was chocolate was indigenous there. That's right. Chocolate was indigenous. So yeah, so coffee was brought there, right?
Here's a question right here.
Yeah.
Okay, doctor. I've been drinking my coffee sweet and blonde my whole life. Okay, so if you're going to recommend a creamer for those of us who have to drink their coffee that way, do you have a professional recommendation?
Well, David's comment about chelation is true probably for all milk, but you know, and I don't really care if you have soy milk or skim milk, but I think both of those are good for you.
Good question. Anybody else have a
Randy Green, first, excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you, Randy.
I was in the coffee business for 40 years, so this is the best presentation on this I've ever heard. So this is a great summarization.
You are making me blush.
One comment for all of you. Note that the cups are 8 ounces. So when you take your travel mug out, and mine is 24 ounces, I'm getting all 3 cups that I need a day. Not having 3 of those, bad.
Cutting you off.
Thank you, Randy.
Jesus.
That's an excellent
He's a
point.
guy that always ruins everything. Any other last questions for Dr. Rissover? We'll thank him in a few minutes, but let's move on to Dave. Come on.
David Gaines, the chief of LaTerza, and I'll turn the microphone, or is yours working?
I think mine's working.
Okay, I'll take this one.
Well, we should leave that here just in case. Yeah, that's great. So I can answer additionally a couple questions. So we talked about the cream, and I think that is absolutely where coffee gets its bad rap, right? Coffee is, we know it as this ultra bitter drink. The darker you roast it, we're basically burning out the sugars that naturally are in coffee. Coffee is a seed of a fruit. So there's a lot of really great sugars that are in that. And if you have a really great coffee, the trick is to roast the coffee and highlight all those natural sugars that are in there. So really, to your question about how do okay, so I really do like my cream in the coffee. Well, one trick would be to start with really great coffee, and that's going to have some natural sweetness to it, because again, we're trying to highlight what's in the coffee naturally. Another trick is when coffee is brewed, it's about 200 degrees. And by the time it gets poured into your cup, we're talking about 180 degrees. Well, at that temperature, maybe you can speak a little bit more medically than I can, but from what I understand, at that temperature, the only taste buds that really are fully engaged are the bitter taste buds. So many of us pour coffee, we drink it, ooh, that's bitter. We add the cream, that's better. What we've really done is cooled it off. So about 145 degrees is when the rest of our mouth really starts to be engaged. And that's when we're able to taste some of these natural sugars that are in there. Now, again, if you have bad coffee to begin with, and then you cool it off and you drink it, it's going to be worse than the bitter that we had at the beginning. But if you have this really great coffee, like the coffee over there that we brought today, has got some really amazing sweetnesses to it, naturally occurring. And if you let it cool off, that full bouquet really just opens up. And so that's one of the tricks. If you want to start weaning away from cream and sugar, the key is to let it cool off, and that'll kind of highlight some of that. And then I can answer too the question, how did coffee get to South America, Central America? So in 1616, the King of France was discovering all this amazing coffee. Coffee is loosely related to the Industrial Revolution. You know, so we have the plagues and everything that's going on, and the safe thing to drink at that time was beer. They didn't know it at the time, but it was the boiling of the water to make the beer that killed all the germs that was causing the plague. So they knew beer was the thing to drink. Well, imagine trying to be productive at work and the first thing you've had in the morning is beer. Even if it's a low alcohol version, it still was beer. So coffee was kind of being introduced into Europe and taking over, and coincidentally maybe was where the Industrial Revolution started to take place. And so the King of France was really wanting to take this further. This is all during the colonial period, and so they brought it over to South America, and it kind of began. There's a lot of other like war stories that happened that once it got to that, but he's the guy that did that in 1616. So there's a couple additional bits of information from those questions. So LaTerza, I call myself the chief visionary of LaTerza because I'm way up in the clouds and trying just to look way ahead in the future and guide our team. LaTerza is Italian. And so that's our way to say, hey, Italy, thank you for inventing espresso machines. We really like them. But the direct translation is the third. So there's a lot of threes that show up in coffee. Coffee is sourced today from 3 major regions in the world. We talked about Ethiopia, so that's East Africa. Also this Rwanda, Uganda. Kind of was fascinating to go back for a second to the history of trade. It went from Ethiopia to Yemen, just north of Ethiopia, stayed there for about 1,000 years before it really started to spread out. 1616 was when it went to the Central South America. It was the late 1800s, coffee went full circle and it landed in Kenya, which is just south of Ethiopia. So it began its whole journey here and it ended basically in the same part of the world. So very, very old tradition about growing coffee, and literally the next neighboring country is the newest technology from the late 1800s for growing and producing coffee. Let's see. So East Africa was the first region. Central South America is the second region. And then Indonesia, the Pacific Asia, Southeast Asia islands is the third region. Now, each one of those regions has pretty specific flavor profiles. Coffee is very similar to wine in its production. It follows some of the same, even the language that we get. So we have kaldi and that kafa. In Yemen, the word they use for coffee is kahawa. And that's their word, that's Swahili, that's their word for wine. And so that kahawa also is some roots to the word. So it went from kahawa to cafe to coffee. Kahawa to kawe to cafe to coffee. That's kind of where we're getting that word. So the original language parallels wine as well. But it's seasonal. It can change flavor profile from year to year. It can change flavor profile from the way you farm it. Just like a bottle of Cabernet from Napa Valley is going to be different from one producer to the next. So each region has its own flavor profile. We're talking, when we're describing coffee, and you can check out even just the packages, we're trying to describe it in 3 different ways. One is the body of the coffee. So a common question that we get asked often is, hey, what's your darkest roast coffee? And we have kind of a window of light to dark, but we're technically a light roaster. And it's specialty grade coffee tends to be a light roaster or ultra light. So our darkest is probably lighter than the lightest of Starbucks. Did I say that right? Our darkest is lighter. Yeah. So when you have the specialty coffee, this light roast is really enhancing these sugars. Roasting coffee is really very similar to making caramel. Has anyone ever made caramel before? Yeah. So it's to make caramel, your sugar and a little bit of milk and butter and slowly heating it up and constantly stirring. And then as it heats up, eventually, it starts to caramelize and all these proteins and sugars are breaking down together and we're getting that golden color. The exact same thing, that's called the Maillard reaction. The exact same thing is happening when we're roasting coffee. And so if we have coffee that has these amazing sugars in it, we want to capture it before it burns out. And so, when you make caramel, there's kind of light caramel and dark caramel and that whole thing. And that's really what we're doing. So what we're doing is enhancing these sugars that are in the coffee. And so Central South American coffees tend to be very chocolatey and nutty. African coffees tend to be a lot more sweet and wine-like. And then Indonesian coffees tend to be very big and bold and earthy. And that, just like there's the 3 different regions, the reasons why there's those flavor profiles, and this is somewhat generally speaking, there's some overlap. But the reason why we have those flavor profiles is because there's 3 main processes that we're at the farming level doing with coffee. So a wash process, we're pulling a cherry off of a tree and then it depulping it quickly. And then it goes through this 20-ish day fermentation process. And that just produces a really chocolatey, nutty flavor of coffee. African coffees, the reason why they tend to be sweet, floral, very delicate and wine-like, water is a scarce resource in Africa. So you don't wash the coffee. You let it dry in the sun. It's called a natural process coffee. So that cherry kind of raisins, all those sugars really intensify and that cherry pulls those sugars in. So they're very delicate and even roasting them is a little bit more difficult because we have a lot more sugar content that's in that seed. And so that's where we're getting a little bit more of the sweetness. And then the Indonesian coffees, the reason why they're bold and earthy, so all those Pacific islands are rainforest and coffee does go through this fermentation process. Well, it's super humid there. And if we went through the traditional methods, the coffees would mold and kind of ruin before we could get to good coffee. So they speed up the process. And basically what they do is they cut the cherry open, they expose the bean, and then it's absorbing the salt and earth from the air. So that's the reason why they're a little bit more bold and earthy. So those 3 regions of the world, that was the first 3. LaTerza we're passionate about really bringing some of the best coffee in the whole country here, and we're only located about 10 minutes south from here. We stand on 3 big pillars. One is working closely with our farmers and importers, and that does a couple things for us. It really establishes a relationship, so we're able to work with our farmer, maybe work with them on the growing practices, continue just to kind of make that better. The farming practices play a significant role in the quality of the coffee. But that relationship also allows us to ask the question, hey, what's a true living wage for you and your family and the community? Coffee can be very empowering for a lot of people. Unfortunately, it also is very, coffee today is a leader in the modern day slavery. So we're trying to really combat that. So the way we do that is making sure that we have solid relationships with our farmers and importers and actually making a big difference in the local community. So the second pillar would be, the first pillar is the sourcing. The second pillar is roasting coffee in individual batches. Robert is our head roaster, and he's the one who made the connection for us today. So he's amazing at what he does. He just doesn't like public speaking. But he's really a fascinating individual. He is from Uganda, and he won the African Barista Championship 3 years in a row. So he's a pretty humble guy. So if you ever come to our roastery, and I'll tell you about our roastery in a second, he'll just kind of wave in the background, but he's very, very talented individual. So he moved to Uganda, or from Uganda to Cincinnati. When he moved to Cincinnati, he visited all these roasters in town, and he came back to us and said, let me work at LaTerza. I love what you guys are doing, and I want to be a part of it. We're like, We know who you are. Yes, we'll figure out a way to hire you. So that was really cool. But all the coffees that we have are single origin coffees. So we're going to the farm and saying, here's this farm. Just like we have, again, a bottle of wine can be here's the farm in Napa Valley versus like a red blend. So we really focus in on a single origin coffee. Here is the specific farmer and the specific community that it's coming from. And so that roasting process and the dedication that he puts into that is a pretty big deal. That's that second pillar. And then the third pillar is coffee has had its absolute peak in terms of flavor within the 7 to 10 day window of roasting. So there's a few tricks that we can do to prolong that life. We have coffee that's in special packaging that helps add a couple weeks to that. But our brand isn't really in grocery stores all that much because if it's after a month in that package, we're kind of trying to figure out how to pull it off the shelf. So we're at Whole Foods and a couple local grocery stores, but we're treating it a little bit more like bread, and we want to really keep that freshness as a part of it. So we do a lot of, the majority of our business is wholesale throughout Cincinnati. We have over 50 accounts for shops and restaurants. So you've probably all had our coffee before. And then we do a lot of online sales. And the way our systems are built out is everything that's roasted, we roast to order, and everything is roasted and shipped out or delivered within the same day. So if you have, we have a coffee of the month club, and that usually is very popular at Christmas time just to give gifts away. And you can kind of give a 3-month coffee of the month to someone who just really loves coffee or is trying to become healthier, right? So yeah, LaTerza, that's who we are. Again, our roastery is about 10 minutes south from here. We're located in Lockland, and we're built out a little bit different. We're not a coffee shop, though we do have a coffee shop experience at the roastery. Has anyone been to like a brewery around Cincinnati or a brewery tour? Yep. So that's how we're set up. We're in a big warehouse, and we're there because we do roasting tours every Saturday morning. And we bring you in, we pull the curtain back behind the whole process. We roast coffee during the tour. We ask questions. Sometimes specialty coffee is a little bit snobby. And I don't know if anyone's ever had the experience where you go into a coffee shop and you're intimidated by the menu. So again, we have the snobbery knowledge. So if you really are interested in really going deep into learning everything about coffee, we can certainly meet you there and take you as far as you want to go. But we're very passionate about meeting people wherever they're at. There's so much to learn about coffee. I mean, I learned a lot of stuff today about coffee, and it's a lot of fun. So we'd rather just meet people where they're at and just enjoy the process. So the roasting tour is every Saturday morning, and we do some private ones as well. And we just get to bring you into the experience and kind of talk through a lot of the processes and things like that. And it's just so much fun because usually people that come on the tour tend to be a group, right? It's a significant other or family that's in town, really good friends. And usually one person is like coffee geek. Does everyone here love coffee? Does anyone not like coffee? Yeah, hey, that's no problem. Yeah, so that's common on our tour. Like, well, I'm really just along for the ride. So one of the fun things on the tour is we'll sample coffees from the 3 different regions, and we'll talk through letting it cool, and we'll talk through some other tricks about tasting the coffee. And by the end of the tour, not always, but nearly always, the person who's like, nah, coffee's not for me, they're like, okay, that was actually pretty good. And when you learn that kind of information, I'm like, how do I increase my coffee consumption? Because I drink, 2 or 3 cups a day, but that was really good. Like 5 is the magic number. It's kind of a magical fruit. The more that you learn, the more it's like, and if you have really good coffee, that's a good start to starting to enjoy it. And it is something that is very healthy. It gets this bad rap because we're adding a lot of cream and sugar to it. So yeah, our roastery is built like a brewery with a tap room, and we really look at it as an education facility. So anytime it's open to the public Monday through Friday. We encourage people to come in and just interact and have a good cup of coffee together. So that's who we are as a brand. Are there any other coffee questions?
David, one question. What time is the tour on Saturday?
The tour on Saturday, in the summertime, we bump it earlier so we are in a warehouse and we don't have air conditioning. So the summertime, it will change our hours to 9:30 and it lasts for about an hour and a half. Right now, they're at 11 a.m. and they sell out fast. So I think we're booked for the next 2 months.
And what do you have to sign up online for?
Sign up online. They're $10 a person. And they're a blast.
Sounds like fun. Who's got a question right here, Dave?
I'm Dave also. I remember my mom years ago always bought the coffee where you take it to the machine and grind it. What is there, I guess that would help the freshness?
So the best thing to do is grind the coffee at home right before you brew it. The hard part about that is there's two kinds of grinders. There's the blade grinder, those are like $10, right, at the grocery store. That's really not very good for coffee. So we're introducing, that's really a spice grinder that they've used for coffee. The problem with the blade grinder is that it's not a consistent grind, and depending on how you're brewing it, you want the grinds of the coffee to be the same size, and different sizes for different brewing methods. So you can't get that out of the blade grinder. And then it also introduces a lot of heat and friction, which then alters the flavor of the coffee. So if you don't have a burr grinder, which can be about $70 to $120, it probably is better for us to grind it and get it ground, and then you grind it at home. But, when you grind coffee, you've taken that 7 to 10 day window of freshness to about 30 minutes.
And would you say the name of that grinder that you?
Yeah, it's called a burr grinder, B-U-R-R. And it crushes the beans at a pretty uniform size.
I have two questions, Dave. The first one I know the answer to. This coffee we're drinking, when was it roasted?
The coffee we're drinking, it was roasted today.
How about that? Can't get much fresher than
Yeah,
that.
and then we actually ground it on purpose. So the magic window is like 3 to 7 to 10 days. We roasted it today, and if we had drunk it right away, we would still get a lot of burntness. The carbon dioxide would still be a part of that. So we roasted it and then ground it and then let it rest for about 3 hours, and then I brewed it.
Can't get better than that. I'm curious. I didn't realize this about the coffees in the different areas. I think to myself, I know Kona coffee. That's a distinctive flavor. I guess that's like a Pacific Rim coffee. It tastes its own flavor. Could you tell me how it gets that way?
I can't specifically speak to Kona coffee, but it would follow that Indonesian Pacific Rim. Yeah, it's going to be a lot more humid. Kona coffee is very expensive, mainly because it's grown in the U.S. economy, right? So we have lots of different economies of scale and a fair wage. The median income for the world is $7 a day, and if you earn $7 a day, you're actually doing pretty good. Now it's a different kind of living. Like only 11% of the world's population own a car, so we're not talking that kind of living. And that's what we're trying to work with. So a lot of the Central South American, we're dealing with second, third world economies. And so those are kind of the wages that we're shooting for. So African coffees are Hawaiian coffees tend to be very expensive because they're in our economy. Same thing with Puerto Rico. The quality is not really as good as what we could buy in green from other places of the world.
Here's a question right here.
My name is Mel. I prefer a dark roast coffee, and I do not contaminate it with hazardous materials such as the sugar and the creamer. Unless it's a restaurant coffee where you have to give it some flavor. But I find that when I have a good coffee, I don't drink near as much as some of the other stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, we're a specialty roaster, and what that means is coffee is rated on a scale like wine is. That 90+ bottle of wine is amazing. Same thing with coffee. So Robert, I get to talk about all these awards that he's won. What really makes him special is he's called a Q grader. So he's got this certification. It's a very intensive process. But a Q grader is someone who grades the quality of the coffee. And in wine parallels, you have wine sommelier is that person that kind of knows that. And then there's a master sommelier. And the master can say, yeah, this was grown on this region in France just by tasting, that bottle of wine. Well, in coffee world, a Q grader is more that master sommelier level. So that's really where Robert's expertise shines. So a specialty roaster is someone that's buying coffee that's been rated 85 and up. Anything that's rated 85 and below, and really once it's below 75, then it doesn't really get rated. And the coffees that are below the 85 tend to be roasted darker, so if you have those coffees that are below that, I meant to say this earlier, if you have the coffees that are below that 85 mark or 80-ish mark, all those sugars are still present, but they're highlighting flavors that we're not a fan of. Weird things like mushroom and rotting wood and potato, just like that's not what we want to get out of our coffee. So the solution is to roast it darker. And so we're kind of burning out those sugars, and then we're left with that bold and bitter flavor profile. So there are lots of reasons why Starbucks has that flavor profile. One of them being it's a little bit lower grain quality of coffee. But there's also, if you grew up on Folgers and, it's just this really bold, intense cup, you probably still really like it and probably like ours less. Yeah, absolutely. I did want to point out this farm. This is a typical farm. This is from a farm in Guatemala, and you can see just rows of coffee trees. And you can see that the trees are only about 6 to 8 feet tall based on the two gentlemen that are in the photo. Now, coffee is the second traded commodity in the whole world. So of all the things that we trade, coffee is number 2. Any guesses on what number 1 is? Oil. Great guess. So oil's number 1, coffee's number 2. And there's several ways to measure it. I'm talking specifically about actual dollars traded back and forth. So the next question I have for you, you see all these trees. We know that coffee is the second traded commodity in the whole world. How many roasted pounds of coffee do you think one tree produces per year? So one hint is coffee loses about 20% of its weight when we roast it. Any guesses? Bingo, perfect guess. So most guesses that I get are 10 pounds, 5 pounds, 100 pounds. I think my guess when I was 10 pounds, but the answer is 1 pound. And we sell our coffee in 12-ounce bags. My wife and I make a pot of coffee every morning, which means we go through about a 1 12-ounce bag per week. That means of this picture, my wife and I are 39 trees. So that means that there's a lot of coffee trees around the world. So that's why we're passionate about the living wage component. That's why we're passionate about really making sure we're highlighting everybody's work throughout the process. At least 50 hands have touched this coffee before we get it here in the US. And then we're putting a lot of energy and dedication into that roasting profile. So that's part of the reason why we're so passionate about that. We really just are trying to honor the dignity and work of all humans that are working on this product.
One last question.
This is not to put you on the spot, but
Sure.
I heard a news story, that price of coffee in America is going up per cup, and the growers are getting less and less.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm suspect of the source of that story, I'd like to hear, is there another side to that?
Yeah, there's kind of some horror stories in that. And for us, that's why the relationship with the importer and the farmer is so important. Like we know the farmers that we're working with. We know the importers that we're working with, and there's a handful of them in the world that in this country that are really just doing amazing work with these communities. So the best thing that we can do is establish relationships. The consumer, it really stinks. There's so many labeling laws that I wish were different in the US. So for example, fair trade certification is something that we think is really good. And I think whoever started fair trade, I might be stepping on some toes, and I do apologize, but whoever started fair trade had, I think, really great intentions. The reality is, To get that stamp on the side of the bag, only 20% of the product has to be fairly traded. That's the global standard. The US standard is actually only 10%.
Wow.
So we are paying a premium, $2 a bag for that stamp, which may only have 10%. Hopefully it's 100%. But so fair trade, like we think we're doing something really great for the consumer, and the final seller is who made the most money, not the actual producer. So that's why the relationship is really important. And that's why most specialty coffee roasters, there's a handful of us in Cincinnati. There's about 20 roasters overall in Cincinnati. But the specialty coffee roasters tend to be a little bit more socially driven and passionate about making sure everything's cool. So,
Okay, so did you learn more about coffee tonight than you thought you were going to? My goodness. Let's thank Dr. Rissover first. Thank you so much. Jill and I back there, we're going to be drinking coffee all day tomorrow because of you, Dr. Rissover. Thank you. And David, thank you so much for coming and bringing your great coffee. There's some coffee back there. Please, let's grab it all up. And wanted to introduce you to one of our board members right in the back there, Ken Bowman. He's got he's got his hand up. He's going to be sponsoring our great class on, I always get it confused, is it the 16th or the 18th, Ken? The 16th, which is a week from Tuesday, on the Doolittle Raid, which is our first World War II class this semester. Thank you all for coming. Have a great night.